Well, hello and welcome to today's event. I think we're gonna begin now. Today's event is hosted by APCO Worldwide and Oxford Analytica, and we're grateful that you could join us. My name is James Robinson, and I will be your MC today. I'm sitting in sunny Brooklyn, but usually I'm leading APCO's Geo-Commerce Solutions practice from our New York office. Before we start today, I'd like to take care of a couple of housekeeping matters. Today's discussion is joined by more than 200 clients, colleagues, and a few members of the media. We're on the record, and indeed after today's session, a recording of the webinar will be available at apcoworldwide.com/coronavirus, along with a number of other resources. Our distinguished panel will spend about 30 minutes sharing their insights, and then we'll have the second half of the call devoted to questions and discussions. Lines will be muted throughout, but if you'd like to register a question or make a comment, please either raise your hand using the Zoom application or type a question directly into the Q&A box. For people dialing in by phone, please dial *9 on your keypad so that we know you want to make a comment. If you do speak, please introduce yourself by name and your organization and limit your comment or question to no more than a minute. So APCO Worldwide is an advisory and communications firm that supports clients globally. Since the COVID-19 crisis first emerged in China, we've been working with clients in every corner of the world to stay informed, engaged, and ahead, gathering intelligence, handling crisis communications, game planning scenarios, helping to engage with employees, investors, consumers, and supporting their social impact work. And increasingly over the past couple of weeks, we've been supporting clients as they look to understand the lifelines that are being offered by their national governments through stimulus plans and relief efforts, and to engage those governments in ways that will allow them to reemerge from this moment stronger. We held our first COVID-19 focused webinar 3 weeks ago today on March 11th. That day, there were a total of 114,000 cases and 4,000 deaths globally. As of yesterday, there were 857,000 cases and more than 42,000 deaths globally. In this 3-week period, we have seen unprecedented action by businesses, investors, and governments. We've just learned that 6.6 million people in the US claimed unemployment last week. As you know, last week, the US government passed a $2.2 trillion relief and stimulus bill. And at least another $1 trillion of spending is underway by other governments globally. So today we wanted to convene a discussion to try and make sense of these jaw-dropping numbers and look forward to the mid and long-term financial implications. To do this, we're joined by a truly distinguished panel of experts from APCO's International Advisory Council, and their experience truly cuts across sectors, geographies, and issue expertise. Without further delay, I'd like to first invite Nick Redmond, the Director of Analysis at Oxford Analytica, the economic and geopolitical risk firm, to set the context with a brief macroeconomic and geopolitical analysis of where markets stand today, particularly outside the US. Nick, over to you.
James, thank you very much. Well, although the title here of this presentation is Endgame, I think it's worth underscoring that many of us in Europe and America are really only at the start of what could be a lengthy lockdown or the initial stages of a first lockdown. And the notion that the world is at some point going to simply snap back to normal later this year looks to me like another instance of humanity's disinclination to deal well with profound, instant, shocking change. I think it's worth underlining we're in the midst of a gigantic global experiment in terms of government. There was no playbook for this. Yet many governments in different parts of the world have converged with regard to priorities and policies. On priorities, nearly every government attempting to limit or slow the spread of the virus at the cost of most normal economic activity. The mix of motives differ, but the two main are to avoid a large number of deaths among the elderly and the overwhelming of healthcare systems. On policies, many states are now observing social distancing, self-isolation, closing workspaces, closing airports, resorts, and public spaces. The East Asian economies that have remained open are the ones who have recent experience of dealing with the pandemic and stood up rapid, reliable testing capacity in short order. I think to come back to my point about an experiment. As time goes on, it is not axiomatic that all governments will stay the course in the face of mounting economic carnage. In many countries, relations between those in power and the population are in new territory. And this new compact is shaky, it's untested, and it may not last. Turning briefly to Asia, China, of course, had first mover advantage here, and it initiated a massive lockdown that appears to have halted the domestic spread of the virus. However, the country is vulnerable to a second wave imported from overseas. The economy certainly has taken a hit. Some go so far as to suggest an unprecedented double-digit GDP contraction in Q1. And right now, we're in a confused situation where some local governments in Beijing are not in lockstep. Beijing is trying slowly to bring the economy back online, but some regions are still engaging in a tightening process. Over the Taiwan state, Taiwan has been the poster child of an effective response, despite its exposure to mainland China. It moved very fast to impose entry bans, and it was able to trace contacts and isolate people before numbers could grow to a point where a major lockdown was needed. South Korea, by contrast, started poorly, but it has then used contact tracing and self-isolation to great effect. And today it has relatively few restrictions in place compared to the West or many parts of China. Hong Kong is a very hygiene-conscious society after SARS and bird flu, had a certain advantage here, so social distancing was pretty much spontaneous. It closed the border with China, but a second wave of infection has now prompted extensive entry bans and the closure of the entertainment and catering sectors. Japan also, after a slow start with the Diamond Princess, closed schools a while back, and it is gradually stepping up countermeasures as the government fears a coming spike that could overwhelm the health system. So a lockdown is in prospect with Japan. The emergency laws have been passed, but not yet put into practice. And there are concerns that the level of testing in the country is inadequate and doesn't actually show the full extent of the outbreak. North Korea, of course, entered a complete lockdown, very early stages of the outbreak. And reports of possible outbreak have been concealed in the country because it has perhaps one of the world's weakest health systems. Lockdown is really the only option. And North Korea is one of the cases that we are particularly worried about. So those, I think, some of the context that you asked me to provide at the start. In Europe, the major countries are all now pretty much locked down. A number of them have passed measures to stimulate the economy, to try and preserve some, at least, economic activity over this period, so that some businesses will be in place. So a lot of people would still be able to pay their rent and their bills. Within Europe, however, we see already there's a looming dispute between some of the northern traditionally credited countries such as Netherlands and Germany on one hand, and some of the others about whether the EU can mutualize debt. Thank you.
Nick, thank you. That was very insightful. Next, I'd like to go to Georges Hugeot. Georges founded Galileo Global Advisors and works on a range of cross-border mergers, acquisitions, and restructuring. He was formerly head of the International Group of the New York Stock Exchange and president of the European Investment Fund. Georges, sitting where you are in the world and with your great experience, perhaps you could give us your midterm view and say a few words about the things that businesses should be looking at as they consider their financial position at this moment. You're on mute, George. I'm going to try and unmute you.
I'm unmuted, I guess. Okay.
Yes, great.
Good. Sorry about that. Good morning to you, and thank you for spending time with us to try to do what is almost mission impossible. We are facing a situation where some of the parameters of our reasoning have been deeply shaken over the past few months, including a serious crisis of trust. Not just trust in governments, but to be honest with you, trust in ourselves. We are now facing the consequences of the policies that have been put together by the governments to try to limit the impact that James was talking about. And of course, that is the #1 priority. from a business standpoint, the conversations that I'm having now with clients and also on the media and everything is going beyond what I call the hill of the coronavirus to go to the mountain of what the economy will look like in a few months. The first thing is we do not know, and it's probably one of the biggest unknown, how much damage by the time we go back to work, quote unquote, normal. And let's call it this summer to be conservative. What will be the stage of the economy? How much of those situations will have basically not just disrupted the business, but destroyed business? And what James was saying, which effectively came this morning, is we were at 3.3 million a week ago unemployment, we're at 6.6 today. So we are going to talk about massive unemployment, and there are even some people who talk about a 30% unemployment. I don't believe we will go there. But now I'm putting myself in the shoes of those of us here who have the responsibility for businesses. The first thing is that we are entering a very severe recession. We know what a recession brings, and it brings reduction of sales, possibilities of more than one bankruptcies, including some major bankruptcies. But the biggest difference, and this is what we need to understand compared to 2008, here we are global. Remember that in the financial crisis, it was pretty much transatlantic. Asia was not really severely hit. Here, Asia, which represents more than 50% of the population of the world, is in. We have also a second element, which is that this is across industries. This is not just about the financial stability and rescuing the financial system. But what happened in the last 10 years is that the governments have been excessively borrowing. They have accepted high budget deficit at times of growth. If you remember the Bible and the story of the pharaohs and Moses, where it was very clear that you had to keep for a few years some reserves when things go well. We have not done that. We have done the reverse. We have increased our debt. So what does that mean going forward? First, you have to be intensely strategic. What part of your business is essential for your survival? What part is important and what part is just good to see? I was just off the phone of a major company in Japan that has been selling $6.5 billion already of businesses to try to reduce its debt and go back. First thing is be strategic. Second, do everything you can to reduce your leverage. And third, when we come to the M&A market, we are going to have the usual complication of a situation where on the one side, as I was saying, the companies who sell their businesses are going to face a market that basically prices those properties at, call it 60 or 50% of the value they paid for. They might not just be able to do what is strategically meaningful because that would put them in bankruptcy. But there will also be huge opportunities for acquisitions for people who are in a situation where they have not been over-indebted. We should not have bought back our shares for 5 trillion. We should not have leveraged the companies the way we did. But, and I will finish on that, my main concern now is that with the massive dislocation of the stimulus package, we are now putting all our attention on the fact that since the financial crisis, governments have tripled their borrowing and central banks have quadrupled their government bonds. And that means that the financial structure and the financial stability structure of the public side is at the moment limited in its capacity to act. And this massive dislocation might create a sovereign debt crisis. And that is also something that we need to watch. And I'll stop there, James.
George, thank you. Very sobering thoughts there. I'm now going to turn to Beth Brooke, who has really spent the past 30 years getting ready for this moment. Beth serves on several boards. She advises CEOs. She was the vice chair of public policy at Ernst & Young for a number of years, and had responsibility for tax policy in the Clinton administration's Treasury Department. Beth, I'd like to ask, what advice are you giving to the CEOs that you're working with and the companies where you serve as a board member?
Sure. Thanks, James. I guess the advice that I'm giving is, like I think everybody is giving, which is hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And that planning for the worst seems to, even the advice a week or two ago, plan for the worst looks even more dire. I was talking with a few CEOs from China a few days ago, and a few days ago they were on day 68 of from when this started for them. And what they relayed was that they feel like they're at the halfway point. So I think when some of us in the US perhaps feel like, our supply chains are back up and running and things are coming back to life, they indicate they feel like they're at halftime, and that it was easier to shut things down than perhaps it is to start things back up. So I think that's instructive for CEOs today and for boards to understand that this isn't going to just reopen when that time comes. It will probably, the duration and severity obviously will have an impact, but we could be in for a very long haul here. And the biggest risk, I think, when I talk with CEOs is to think about the domino effect of this. As the debt markets are obviously shaky, but not just the overall macro picture, but the micro picture of your particular company is it's understanding your exposure to third parties as well. So it's not just the stability or lack thereof in your supply chain and your liquidity and your cash flow, but it's understanding your exposure to third parties and that domino effect. So I'm actually working with CEOs now who are trying to help their vendors or their customers through SBA loans and financing options that are in at least the CARES package in the United States, but really trying to help the stability of their suppliers through this. There's clearly going to be then, in I guess, James, in consulting with boards, it's trying to help boards keep their head up. There's obviously going to be dislocation. We're going to have a massive reset. You think about, 9/11, and you think about the TSA and all that came after that, or you think about the AIDS epidemic and then how a large segment of the population adjusted. We're going to go through the same thing around the world here. With sectors being reimagined in many ways. It's trying to help boards stay focused on, when we went into this, companies were getting very focused on their purpose, why they exist, how they are sustainable for the long term, how they behave through this with their employees, with their customers, with their vendors, with their supply chains, says everything about their commitment to that purpose. And when we reemerge from this time and we reset, that will still matter. And while oftentimes CEOs are just trying to deal with the people issues, the safety and well-being, the liquidity, the operational risks, the board can be very helpful in trying to keep looking forward as to the purpose, what we will be, who we will be, and as George said, the M&A opportunities that will be there. And the investors, from what I'm at least hearing and seeing, is the investors aren't going to let up on the ESG focus. they are going to, and as all shareholder meetings are converting to virtual meetings, they're still going to be focused on the executive comp issues, the human capital management issues, diversity issues, how you're engaging with stakeholders. And I think what I'm finding is CEOs sort of think, we can take our eye off that ball right now, dealing with the short term. And I think that's a mistake. I think investors are going to be more focused than ever on the ESG issues, the E and the S and the G, and the governance issues. And I guess the last thing I would say, James, is just the magnitude of the speed. As you said at the outset, there were, I think, 857,000 cases yesterday. Today, we hit the milestone of 1 million confirmed cases today around the world. So the escalation is severe, but the long, again, I'll go back to the situation in China. I think this is going to take much longer than most CEOs are thinking and planning for to work our way out of this over time. So again, hope for the best, but very much plan for the worst.
That's terrific. And one thing you said triggered something in my mind. Middle of last year, the Business Roundtable, representing a couple of hundred of America's biggest corporations, sort of famously came out and redefined the purpose of a company to say that it's to promote an economy that serves all Americans, not just the shareholder. And maybe this is something we can come back to in the discussion, but I'd love to get your perspective on whether that statement is more relevant today or less relevant today. But before we do that, I wanted to turn to Terry Gronke, who is Chairman and CEO of Erie Street and lead director for APCO. After 30 years as a serial entrepreneur, Terry founded Erie Street, which invests in high growth companies in particularly the business service sector. Terry, you're an owner, an operator, and have weathered prior crises. I know you often actually invest in industries at moments of disruption. Are there some things that you would offer to leaders maybe on this call, some advice on how to sustain themselves during this disruption, but also what they may do to emerge stronger from this moment?
Thanks, James. First, let me start with, I'm happy to be here despite the circumstances and contribute what I can based on my experience and experiences having been involved with over 50 companies. And as you pointed out, many of them, more than 20% of those were raw startups. And most of those, or certainly a good share, were grown and developed in troubling times. I actually started my first business in the early 80s when interest rates were 20%. Before I go there, I'd like to just say I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy on this call, and everyone's families are doing well in this unprecedented time. Clearly, as business leaders and as a country, speaking just for the U.S., we're in uncharted waters, and this environment is far from unusual. None of us have ever been here before, and so we're all just kind of piling up our sets of experience to give our best perspective of what this could look like. From my perspective, first and foremost, you need to wrap your arms around the people that you're working with, both well, at this point, figuratively. We're not allowed to do it literally anymore, and so from just a human care point of view, make sure that everyone, both physically and emotionally, are safe. We're all, in this uncharted home confinement world where we're learning how to work on Zoom calls like this, and with Microsoft Teams and other great technologies that are kind of carrying us through this. As we look at the macro perspective, there's a lot going on in the U.S. with the CARES package, which I'm sure we'll get into in just a second. But the immediate focus needs to be from a pure business point of view. Once your people are stabilized and comfortable, it has to be on liquidity. Over the course of the next at least 90 days and probably closer to 120 or even 180, there's going to be a short-term liquidity crisis in and around particularly certain sectors, and that's where the immediate focus needs to be. hopefully later in this call, we'll have a chance to talk about the upside. And I think there's a lot of upside. Remember, there is just in private equity alone, there's a $1.5 trillion sitting on the sidelines with a clock against it, waiting to be invested. And so to George's point, I think there's going to be a pretty robust opportunity to build businesses through both M&A and through organic growth, as both George and Beth pointed out earlier in their comments. I think from a sector perspective, I'm not shedding any light on things that you don't already know, but certainly travel, retail, hospitality, restaurants are hammered. Healthcare is kind of a plus and a minus depending on which side of the equation that you're on. And same with delivery of both food and goods and services. There's clearly some very blue sky coming on the other side of this for any businesses that can help in and around helping companies emerge from this. So think consulting services, both management consulting, IT consulting, and the like. Certainly business services as people start to think about how they're going to grow the business from the top of funnel point of view. And so I think it's really an important point in time over the course of the next short term, certainly Q2 and probably Q3, to really, as leaders, focus our energies from what we're trained to do, which is think strategically, to really get down into sea level, ground level, and focus tactically. Our businesses and our teams, and in many cases, our community need it more than ever.
Terry, thank you for that look and a tinge of optimism there, which is nice. I'm going to zoom out now and turn to Steve Bartlett, and we're really honored to have Steve with us. Steve, like many of you, serve on the IAC, but brings really diverse and unique perspectives. Steve served as mayor of Dallas, as well as in the US Congress, where he was part of the House Banking Committee, and so brings really interesting perspectives from public service. But I'm particularly interested in his perspectives from his years as CEO of the Financial Services Roundtable, where he helped the financial services industry navigate the 2008 Great Recession. So Steve, if I could turn to you and perhaps ask you to talk about two things. Firstly, any kind of lessons learned from navigating the fallout from the Great Recession, and then specifically your thoughts on the US government's relief and stimulus, the so-called CARES Act, and how you see that playing out, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and any advice that you might give for businesses on this call today.
Soon pass, but here we are. First of all, the financial crisis was deep and it was sudden, and it took a while to get out. There were some similarities, but mostly differences between this crisis. The financial crisis was a loss of liquidity in the debt market, leading to in the credit market, leading to the equity market, and then its effect on the real economy. This is different in that it is purely tied to the health crisis, the pandemic. And that pandemic and the health crisis then leads to a collapse of a number of sectors in the real economy. So it's the health crisis direct pipeline to the real economy. The real economy in this case is sort of segmented in that some sectors are simply closed down. And of course, no one's ever seen that, where the travel and the restaurants and the place-based retailing are closed down. But the rest of the real economy is okay, except for that. And that's, of course, where the big exception is. It's clear that when the health crisis is, quote, solved, is behind us, then the real economy will pick back up fairly quickly, I think. The congressional action will help. It was a lot of overly done. It did become a Christmas tree. I counted 105 different government agencies, most of which were not really related to either the health crisis or the economy at all, that funding were increased. But nevertheless, getting the $1,200 checks out to the 30 million Americans will help. The business loans will help a lot because it gets small businesses back restarted again to be able to have some seed capital for 90 days to restart. So it all helps. Congress, it's not clear to me that Congress will be able in the near term to do phase 4. They're going to try, but there's not a common agreement on whether to do it, what to do, and when to do it. The earliest that I think any new legislation will come out of Congress would be June 1, but we really won't know until the middle of May as to whether Congress has some sort of a consensus to act for additional stimulus. One other observation, and that is $2.3 trillion was arrived at just simply because there was no governor. There was no sense of how high is up. There was no limitation. So anybody that had any kind of an idea for spending money, it was put into the bill. So it went quickly from $1 trillion for the checks out the door to $2.3 trillion, including the National Endowment for the Arts and the Museum and Library Services and all manner of other things. It was the congressional way. If there's no limit on the budget, well, then the way to reach a compromise is put everybody's spending in there. Time will tell, but first we have to get the health crisis behind us, and then things will start back up.
Steve, that's terrific. And maybe just one sort of follow-on question before we open it up. What would your advice be to companies who are in a position of distress right now, and who are looking at the relief that bill should provide? What kind of things would you be counseling them to do in order to take advantage of the money set aside by this act?
If a company in those sectors that are truly shut down, just simply no revenue coming in, those companies should act quickly, should negotiate kind of whatever deal they can get from the government to add liquidity, because liquidity is their problem. I think I would also make, as most companies are, make massive adjustments and eliminate dividends, eliminate executive pay, unfortunately do layoffs. If you have workers that are not producing revenue, then they need to be furloughed or laid off. But I would do everything all at once, because time is your enemy. I think Treasury, they will announce today who their financial advisors are for the airline industry. And I think the government in this case will set the terms of the so-called bailout or the liquidity. And I think companies will have to accept pretty much whatever is offered to them in exchange for the liquidity. Again, it's all a matter of the time. So once we get to the other side, they'll be able to sustain themselves. But we first have to get to the other side, and no one knows when that's going to come.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm sure this is something we may come back to in a moment. But before we open it up to questions, I just wanted to share a little food for thought. As I mentioned before, APCO is working with clients all around the world to understand the potential benefits that government stimulus is providing. But we've also been gathering intelligence, and part of that intelligence is public opinion polling. And so for the past 4 weeks, we've run a US opinion poll asking American public their attitudes and views on a range of subjects. And on Monday night, we did a poll of 1,000 Americans asking them about their current economic situation and the reaction they have to the US stimulus, and wanted to share just a couple of observations. Firstly, a staggering 53% of Americans have experienced material impact in their workplace, including pay cuts, furloughs, layoffs, or shifts to the hours that they're being asked to work. Also, and perhaps unsurprisingly, Americans have very strong feelings about where government support and taxpayer dollars should be going during this crisis. And so a couple of the charts here, 58% believe that small businesses should be supported, whereas only 22% of people believe that large companies deserve government support. 50% support extra unemployment benefits. In terms of industries, 66% support funding for healthcare and hospitals, and 58% for restaurants, but only 33% for hotels only 19% for the banks that are lending to distressed businesses, and only 18% for the cruise line industry. So we're gathering a lot of great insights about how the public is responding to this moment. And in addition to, I think, direct engagement with government, there's also a need to explain, for some industries, to explain their role in the wider economy and ensure that they take along the public's support. I know that the banking industry was suffered for probably the past decade for not bringing the public along, and perhaps Congress not fully explaining the systemic importance of the financial sector. So with that, I'm going to turn it to questions, and would encourage anyone on the line to type in their questions. But I'd like to start off with a question around indicators, and ask first George and then Beth, if they're looking, if you're looking at any leading indicators that may be an indication of when we've hit the bottom, and when we're on our way back. So George, perhaps you could give your view on that.
I would make a difference between when the market is going to bottom. In these circumstances, it has reacted extremely strongly, but I believe that it hasn't finished yet. But the classical indices of markets are well known. There is one element that the central banks look at, which looks very mundane in this particular case, but is important, is new car registrations. It is a very anticipatory way of looking whether the confidence that the people restore. So it's going to be very much a question of confidence. And the third one, of course, is when we start seeing a bottoming up of or ceiling, I should say, of the unemployment for the whole economy. The market at the moment has obviously reacted strongly because it did act very optimistically in 2019. So we shouldn't take the correction in the context of what just happened this year. There's been a correction of over-optimism of last year. But investors are going to stay on the sidelines for a while.
Thank you, George.
And James,
and Beth.
And James, yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is just to think about this in a global context. So I don't know if I'm looking at a leading indicator, but we are a global economy, and the ability to restart the economy depends on the actions of every country and the sequencing of this around the world. And that interplay you can't just look at it, I think, within your particular country because it's a global economy. And therefore, there's necessarily going to be a drag on the ability to get up and running. I mean, we're seeing that play out in China right now. Their ability to restart is hindered by the rest of us. That's going to just play out around the world, I believe. And so I don't even know what leading indicator I would look at other than to pay attention to that interplay. And again, know that it's not going to be as optimistic as I think we would hope.
And Nick, maybe I can bring you in on this discussion as well, as someone who looks at the global macro picture. What are you looking for? Nick, you're on mute.
Sorry, I mean, PMIs is just one indicator, but we're not yet, I think, anywhere near bottom there. And I think what Beth said up top is absolutely right. Shutting things down is so much easier than starting things up again. And because different regions of the world are at different points through this experience, I think we can see many different supply chain problems cropping up, including Africa. I know you have a question on Africa that maybe we can come on to in a moment. But given that COVID there really is still quite in its infancy in terms of the number of cases that are at least official. Some of the raw materials dependent on Africa actually the fact that you cannot unlock the supply of those necessarily, so 3, 4, 5 months now when you want to, that could ripple right around the world.
Well, let's actually continue with that discussion on Africa. There was a question that was submitted regarding Africa and the relative delay in the apparent spread of the virus, although whether testing is happening yet is not known. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about Africa and what we could sort of see happening there?
Sure. So I know the question was about Africa's ability to cope, and I think it's absolutely the right question to pose, accepting that obviously this is a continent of 54 states, some of which are actually relatively wealthy in terms of GDP per capita, and so capability is by no means evenly distributed across. But if you look at 54 countries right now, at least 49 of them, last time I checked, actually had a confirmed case. So although the overall numbers are quite low, COVID-19 is certainly out into African territory. Governments have imposed a range of containment measures, but there are factors such as urban overcrowding, poverty, lack of amenities, in some cases popular resistance, and will make enforcement quite challenging. So if you look at the African picture, it's Southern Africa that has generally seen the most stringent and effective enforcement measures thus far. Now, the case numbers are relatively low, but there's been some recent research done by the London School of Tropical Medicine that warns that most African countries are going to have on average 1,000 cases by the end of April and more than 10,000 cases by mid-May. But at that 10,000 level, I think the continent's ability to weather the storm and for its health systems in particular to cope becomes very, very difficult.
Mm.
If I can add one element here, James, I have a brother who is in Africa, and what is happening is that the virus is spreading, but we don't have the data because they don't have the data or they don't want to give data. But the second element is that the population is reacting much more strongly than we do because they know that they do not have any hospital infrastructure to deal with the virus. So they look at the virus, it's much more deadly because there is no protection.
Hmm. I'm going to pivot slightly to a question from our colleague Jeff Zerkowitz, who asks, to what extent are we fighting the last war in terms of fiscal stimulus, interest rate cuts, versus targeting public health or making other types of intervention? Perhaps I could put that to Beth first.
Sorry, trying to get off mute. Well, I think it's an excellent question. And I think the big lesson that we're learning is that our public health infrastructure was simply inadequate. Whether now we're witnessing in supply of masks or ventilators, we just weren't ready, and more needed to be in place. And you just watch the catch up every day. You look anywhere around the world right now and you'd say, what should you, if you were a hospital, be doing? And it would be finding bed space, building bed capacity, because you're going to be overwhelmed. And we're just, we're sort of behind at every turn. But it is an interesting experiment, I think, Nick, as you started out with the grand experiment. I mean, it's interesting to see how Asia was with SARS and with what they faced before. In many ways, their public health infrastructure was much more prepared to handle this. So there's a big lesson learned going on in some of the countries around the world.
Steve, do you have a view on this? So
Yeah,
Sorry,
I do, and that it seems to me that there are two wars at once. Unfortunately, it seems to me that the government's response is massive on the economic war, and it is fighting with the old tools, which is stimulus, put money out in huge, unparalleled amounts of money into the market. And that has an effect, but it won't have much of an effect until the first war, the health war, is at least subdued. And with that, I think we're doing minimal amount. It was only at the last minute that the $100 billion of additional assistance to healthcare and hospitals and supplies was put in. So I think we're doing minimum on the major war, which is the health war, and maximum on the stimulus. And the stimulus will have some stimulating effects, but not much. It's much more of a relief bill to get ready for the health to get the pandemic behind us, so we can turn to the economy. So I think we have our priorities sort of reversed.
Yeah, well, that leads into another question, and I'd love to bring in Terry on this, which is coming out of this. How does the role and appreciation of the private sector versus the public sector shift? In many ways, we're seeing the private sector in the US, at least, the pharmaceuticals sector really stepping up, many contributing their assets to fighting this. But some would argue that the government should be playing a stronger role. What's your view on how things emerge from this?
Yeah, if I could just kind of headline that as sort of relief to recovery and leading into a recovery. I think that what the government has done so far with the CARES Act, and as Steve alluded to, what's coming next from what we've heard, I think they're certainly using as much in their arsenal as I've ever seen in my career. And I tip my hat to Congress for finding a way through what's uncharted waters and a pretty difficult, choppy path ahead in a way that's really not easy by a long shot. I think as we look to the recovery side of this, though, and one of the things we talk about with our staff all the time is it's really important to make sure that you find time every day to smile and find a way to laugh. And what I mean by that is by no means ignoring the seriousness of what's going on, but human nature requires that for us to have the energy we need and the attitude we need to carry on. But a friend recently sent me a note in terms of who's leading your companies right now, and specifically it's a multiple choice question: who's leading digital transformation in your company? Your CEO, your CTO, or COVID-19? And clearly COVID-19 is leading a lot of this, but on the other side of this disruption lies really prosperous transformation. Let me give you one quick example, and that is one of the areas that's been hammered is the entertainment industry, where we have an investment. And basically they've frozen. And just think to yourself for a second, how long before you and your families go sit in a movie theater again? The answer is probably somewhere between a really long time and maybe never. And the industry, at least from the studio level, is completely structured around these major movie releases in theatrical environments. And so because of that change, what I believe will happen ultimately is the technological revolution of being able to protect this asset, this movie, a piece of content, in a way that's much more difficult to pirate, will allow the OTT and streamers to be able to release alongside studios in a way that will benefit consumers, particularly millennials and Zs, in a way they can consume this content the way they want to. And it won't hurt or hammer the content makers the way it is right now. I think we'll see lots of examples like that, James, coming out of the course of the next 6 months. Necessity being the mother of invention, and disruption leaning in and playing offense, causing really interesting businesses to emerge, particularly in small and mid-sized sector.
Yeah. Terry, I'm going to follow up with another question for you, and then my guess is Beth could jump in on this as well. And this comes from an attendee. It was mentioned that the financial and lending market at the moment is pretty chaotic right now. What does this mean for a typically strong company that has traditionally had accepted lines of credit and access to debt when needed? And what should a CFO be doing right now with its lending institutions to sort of hope for the best but plan for the worst related to liquidity?
Yeah, I will say that here in Illinois, we're kind of in week 3.5 of being locked down. The first week was everyone figuring out how to work from home and making sure that technology was in place that people had, and then for some people like me that we had and knew how to use. From that, it evolved into the deep hands in the dirt of the garden, trying to figure out from a liquidity point of view, how do we survive, who's in danger, and how do we make things happen. We immediately went into, with me and my senior staff, as well as with our CFOs, into talking to our banks and lending institutions. I will say, large and small, they were incredibly cooperative. As Nick pointed out earlier in this call, this isn't a financial crisis as much as a health crisis, which is creating an economic crisis. And so we've seen really great, how can we help you support from banks. What changed this week, as recently as yesterday, is I'm starting to see banks, particularly in companies with kind of 100 to 2,000 employees, so small, mid-sized companies, banks leaning in saying, what can we do to help? Do you see opportunities to grow? Are there things that you want to do coming out of the other side of this? And beginning the planning of how do we take advantage of a situation where we can help people, help wounded businesses not just fail, but maybe plug them into something else. It'll lead to a combination of group hire / organic growth, as well as M&A opportunities. And I'm seeing early and optimistic support from banks. I think we're months away from it being overwhelming. And this comment again is small and mid-sized business, not large. So it may be different in the large sector, but I'm very impressed with how they're joining in us, putting our arms around these businesses and finding a way to look forward.
Great. And Beth, maybe just a couple of comments from you, maybe more focused on the larger size businesses.
Well, yeah, I agree with everything Terry said. I would say it's not just banks, and that's where the need, fundamentally right now, the need to engage and communicate. And I know APCO is working with a lot of clients around this, but the need to engage and communicate at every level, whether it's with your bank, but also with your vendors, with your suppliers, with your customers, with your employees. That need to engage and communicate is where there's a lot of people willing to help. There's a lot of people in need, and the need to communicate is helping to equalize the needs and the wants where there's opportunity. So it's not just banks. I'm seeing some just great companies who are in a stronger position, able to really help their supply chains, and that's what's going to get everybody through. And I think the reason it is different than 07, 08 is because it is a health crisis. You do know that there's an end, and so people who can are more than willing to try to help because they do see the opportunity coming out the other side. But you're not going to find those opportunities if you're fearful to engage and be more transparent, and if you're one of the weaker players asking for help.
And James, this is Steve. I might add in. I see it from the bank side, and I hear exactly the same thing from the other side. The banks are in fact going to their customers, both the public, consumer customers, small business, and large business, and coming up with ways to help to provide liquidity and to kind of get across this canyon. I will say that it's not particularly well known, but banks have roughly doubled, maybe 2.5 times their capital base from the financial crisis. So the banks are much more solid as a rock, and they are setting out to help their customers. And on your message earlier, James, that also includes communicating with the public. So Congress does not build public support for the corporations. Corporations have to build public support, and then the public then talks to Congress. So communicate that you care, and that you have a going business.
If I can add one element, James.
Please.
If I look at what the Fed has been doing, what has happened, and this is an observation, and then I will give you a concern. The observation is that about a month ago, CFOs have started drawing on their lines massively, even if they don't need the money immediately, because they were concerned that either the lines would be cut or the liquidity would not be there. By doing that, the corporates have effectively increased the liquidity problem that the Fed was facing. And the Fed responded in its way to that need. But my concern is when I see the Federal Reserve, instead of helping the banks to do what they do, starting to be themselves in their Main Street lending capability, starting to position themselves as Main Street lenders to corporates' risks that they are totally unable to assess and for which they are totally ill-equipped. I don't understand what came to their mind about that, but it's as much as I praise in the part of the package that has been brought by Congress, and it's about half of it. The other half, I believe, is political. But the half that is really helpful is that you go to the individuals and the small companies. And you have SBA lenders there who are the intermediaries and are helping to channel those funds. That is not the job of the Federal Reserve, and they should keep their powder dry, not to go directly and not to assume corporate risk.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, and there's actually a lot more questions that we have to answer. So what I'm going to do is just offer a couple of thoughts and then turn it over to all five of you to within a sentence or two, give your best guess of where we may be in 12 months. But a couple of things that we've been asked about and haven't yet addressed. Where does inflation go over the next year or two? What more impacts may we see on the small business economy, and how does that market sort of shake out? And then the tension between nationalism and global collaboration, and that we're in a moment where national and in some cases even state or subnational governments have really had to step up and lock down and take their own action. But fundamentally, there's a need for global cooperation, both on this, on climate change, on many other issues. And to what extent does business have a role in communicating that need for collaboration and resisting the sort of more nationalist tendencies? So if we could go around the phone, perhaps starting with Nick, just a sentence or two.
Thank you, James. On international aspect, that's actually one of my major concerns here. We know the United States has gone for a big stimulus package, some other big developed economies have, but some places simply don't have that option. They do not have the great credit worthiness in order to flex in this situation. So I'm sure we all missed it really, but about a week ago, Algeria cut its budget by 30%. Why? Because it's an oil and gas exporter. We all know where the oil and gas market is, and that's going to ripple right through the economy. So if we have a reposition across the world of quite a lot of savage pro-cyclical policies right now, the pain could be immense. And that comes on then to the international dimension. The IMF basically is tapped out. It's been prevented from creating any more SDRs. Is there going to be an IMF lead on policy response to help some of these poorer places? And on the monetary side, we know that there's going to be a great dash for dollars right now. The Fed has done extraordinary things in the past in terms of ensuring swap lines are available. Will it continue to do so? So I think in the next 2-3 weeks, James, that's actually what the debate is going to be about, as national responses more or less get at least onto a slightly firmer footing. Is there going to be an international response is the big question.
Great. We are running out of time, so I'm going to go, if we can be really quick. George, if you, just a sentence or two, your perspective a year from now.
As well as in our families and with our friends, we are led to refocus on the core values. I think that is going to be the most important thing that companies and governments should start doing, because what will be expected after this is a system that we can trust.
Yeah, thank you. Beth?
Purpose, how companies communicate their purpose through this period, how they act, how they behave will, as George said, it will define who we are coming out of this. Hopefully the health issues we will have our arms around, but it will be the time for business to step forward. I think what we've seen, 07, 08, the G20 stepped up and acted. This time, not so much. So I think the hope is here in the private sector.
Terrific. Terry.
I'll start with I'll end with what I started with, and that is make sure that you're touching base with your teams on a regular basis, both from a physical and mental health perspective during this time. I believe that coming out of Q3 for small businesses, to answer that question directly, will be a robust time if you've managed your liquidity properly through the next 4 months, and you've got lean forward courage to take advantage of what will be undoubtedly many, many opportunities as a result of the weakening of Q2 and Q3.
And thank you, Terry. Steve, final word to you, and particularly, debt and inflation. These are issues I know you're watching carefully.
Well, we have added, we're now with this $2.3 trillion, we've added to the debt so that the debt to GDP ratio will be over 90% by 2030, which is sort of Greece numbers. So I think that's the long term. In the short term, corporations, if I had one thing to do over from the financial crisis, it would be to increase our level of communication with the public and our publics and the customers and the general public tenfold or 100-fold, because the banks never recovered their reputation. They're sort of doing all right, but in spite of all the good things that they're doing, they never really regained their reputation. So other companies now in other sectors, they still have that reputation intact. But from your poll, it shows that there's some real dark clouds on the horizon in terms of public support. So I would concentrate on that.
Great. Well, thank you all. Really appreciate your time this morning. Before I end, I just wanted to again highlight that APCO is going to continue doing weekly polling. We're producing a number of different assets and resources for our clients. And we're going to be doing more of these webinars. We'll be doing one next week focused on the health industry, and one on technology, and another on social impact. And would invite all to learn more at apcoworldwide.com/coronavirus. Again, please reach out if you have questions, and thank you for joining today, and stay well.